the show. Marissa is the mod, we have nice mods too. Jamima gets the docs, don't you know? They're the ones yelling at Baker all day. Yelling at Baker all day. Hey, hey, hey. Yelling at Baker all day. Hey, hey, hey. Yelling at Baker all day. Hey, hey, hey. Making sure he hears what they say.
You may be seated in the court.
Jamie leads with power every day. Marissa keeps the order, come what may. Jamima brings the files without delay. This strong team is here to stay. Yelling at Baker all day. Hey, hey, hey. Yelling at Baker all day. Hey, hey, hey. Yelling at Baker all day. Hey, hey, hey. Jamie, Marissa, Jamima, we have nice mods too. They're the ones yelling at Baker all day. Yelling at Baker all day. Hey, hey, hey. Yelling at Baker all day. Hey, hey, hey. Yelling at Baker all day. Hey, hey, hey. Jamie, Marissa, Jamima, we have nice mods too. Yeah!
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are, whoever you are, what, if any, you might be, and welcome to the closing arguments in the ISAAC, whatever Marissa claims he's called, murder trial. There has been a lot of arguing over nothing. The defense has asked to bring in some swords as demonstrations during their closing arguments. They were only allowed to bring in one of them. They will not be putting on a defense. There won't be no rebuttal. It'll be state, break, defense, and then state again for the closing arguments, and then jury instructions, and hasta luego, off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz, and jury deliberations. So I didn't catch if they had a time limit on the closing arguments, but the defense has put on no trial, has asked nothing but stupid questions, so their closing better be fire, or else there's nothing they can do to win this case, in my opinion. And about 80% of you believes the same thing, that this didn't go great. It's been a weird case. The only interesting witnesses are the one who did it, who I didn't find especially believable, the lead detective, because she showed us all of the communications, and that guy to evaluate their relationship, it's kind of like body language to me. It's you're reading tea leaves. You don't know their dynamics just because you read a few text messages and stuff like that. So the lead detective and the killer are the only two witnesses I actually think is worth anything in this case. But they just came back in the room, so let's get over there and see how they close.
Ladies and gentlemen. All right, let's go back on the record. We reconvene in criminal cause D101CR 2023-25 with counsel, Mr. Apodaca, and the jury all present. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. I'd like to thank you for your patience this morning. The attorneys and I have been working, getting ready to begin the day. So let's get started. The state having rested in its case in chief, we turn to the defense. Testimony evidence on behalf of Mr. Apodaca. Counsel.
Defense will rest, Your Honor.
Thank you. Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, with the defense having rested, that concludes the proofs or the cases for the both parties. So you have heard all of the evidence in the case now. It is my duty to tell you the law that you must follow in this case. What I'm going to do next, ladies and gentlemen, is go through and read the jury instructions to you. Before I begin, let you know that you're going to have a written copy of all of the instructions, but we read the instructions to you at this point in time because the attorneys often like to argue as part of their closing statements to you the relationship between the evidence that you have heard and the law that governs the case. So, just wait a second for everyone to have a seat.
I thought
Let's
your
begin.
instructions was-
Instruction number 1. The law governing this case is contained in the instructions that I am about to give to you. It is your duty to follow the laws contained in these instructions. You must consider these instructions as a whole. You must not pick out one instruction or parts of an instruction and disregard the others. A copy of these instructions will be given to you when you begin your deliberations. Instruction number 2. The law presumes the defendant to be innocent unless and until you are satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt of guilt. The burden is always on the state to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It is not required that the state prove guilt beyond all possible doubt. The test is one of reasonable doubt. A reasonable doubt is a doubt based on reason and common sense, the kind of doubt that would make a reasonable person hesitate to act in the graver and more important affairs of life. Number 3, you alone are the sole judges of the facts in this case. It is your duty to determine the facts from the evidence produced here in court. Your verdict should not be based on speculation, guess, or conjecture. Neither sympathy nor prejudice should influence your verdict. You are to apply the law as stated in these instructions to the facts as you find them, and in this way decide the case. Instruction number 4. Your verdict must represent the considered judgment of each juror. In order to return a verdict, it is necessary that each juror agrees. Your verdict must be unanimous. It is your duty to consult with one another and to try and reach an agreement. However, you are not required to give up your individual judgment. Each of you must decide the case for yourself, but you must do so only after an impartial consideration of the evidence with your fellow jurors. In the course of your deliberations, do not hesitate to re-examine your own view and to change your opinion if you are convinced it is erroneous. But do not surrender your honest conviction as to the weight or effect of evidence solely because of the opinion of your fellow jurors or for the purpose of reaching a verdict. You are judges of the facts. Your sole interest is to ascertain the truth from the evidence in the case. Instruction number 5. You must not concern yourself with the consequences of your verdict. Instruction number 6. Excuse me. You alone are the judges of the credibility of the witnesses and the weight to be given to the testimony of each of them. In determining the credit to be given to any witness, you should take into account his or her truthfulness or untruthfulness, his or her ability and opportunity to observe, his or her memory, his or her manner while testifying, any interest or bias he or she may have, and the reasonableness of his or her testimony considered in the light of all the evidence in the case. Instruction number 7. Each crime charged in the indictment should be considered separately. Instruction number 8. You must not draw any inference of guilt from the fact that the defendant did not testify in this case, nor should this fact be discussed by you or enter into your deliberations in any way. Instruction number 9. You may consider whether the defendant committed domestic violence against Kara McCulley on April 4th, 2022, and facilitated sex work of Kara McCulley other than the crimes charged in this case for the purpose of determining the existence of the intent and knowledge that he could have aided and abetted the murder, which is a necessary element of the crime charged, and the preparation or plan to commit first-degree murder, willful and deliberate, as an accessory, and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, willful and deliberate. Instruction number 10. You should consider each opinion received in evidence in this case and give it such weight as you think it deserves. If you should conclude that the reasons given in support of an opinion are not sound, or that for any other reason the opinion is not correct, you may disregard the opinion entirely. Instruction number 10. An expert witness is a witness who, by knowledge, skill, experience, training, or education, has become an expert in the subject. An expert witness may be permitted to state an opinion as to that subject. You should consider each expert opinion and the reasons stated for the opinion, giving them such weight as you think they deserve. You may reject an opinion entirely if you conclude it is unsound. Excuse me. For you to find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree, willful and deliberate, as charged in count 1, The statements prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1, the defendant killed Grace Jennings. 2, the defendant was with the deliberate intention to take away the life of Grace Jennings or another human being. 3, this happened in New Mexico on or about the 29th day, 2022. A deliberate intention refers to the state of mind of the defendant. A deliberate intention may be inferred from all of the facts and circumstances of the killing. The word deliberate
Not much.
means arrived at or determined upon as a result of careful thought and the weighing of the consideration for and against the proposed course of action. A calculated judgment and decision may be arrived at in a short period of time. A mere unconsidered and rash impulse, even though it includes an intent to kill, is not deliberate intention to kill. To constitute a deliberate killing, the slayer must weigh and consider the question of killing and the reasons for and against such a choice. Instruction number 13. For a defendant to be found guilty of a crime, even though the defendant did not do the acts constituting the crime, the statements prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements. 1, the defendant intended that another person commit the crime. 2, another person committed the crime. 3, the defendant helped, encouraged, or caused the crime to be committed. Instruction number 14. For you to find the defendant guilty of murder in the second degree, a lesser included offense of murder in the first degree, willful and deliberate, as charged in count 1, the statements prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1, the defendant killed Grace Jennings. 2, the defendant knew his acts created a strong probability of death or great bodily harm to Grace Jennings. And 3, this happened in New Mexico on or about October 9th, 2022. Instruction number 15. For you to find the defendant guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, willful and deliberate, as charged in count 2. The statements prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1, the defendant and another, by words or acts, agreed together to commit murder in the first degree. 2, the defendant and the other intended to commit murder in the
I'm not sure that they will read parts of the Bible into it.
first degree. 3, this happened in New Mexico on or about October the 29th, 2029. I apologize for my voice. I've got allergies, and the smoke that we have from the surrounding forest fires that we have is not helping. Instruction number 16. In addition to the other elements of second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, the statements prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant acted intentionally when he committed the crime. A person acts intentionally when he purposely does an act which the law declares to be a crime, even though he may not know that the act is unlawful. Whether the defendant acted intentionally may be inferred from all the surrounding circumstances, such as the manner in which he acts, the means used, his conduct, and any statements made by him. Instruction number 17 is a definition. Great bodily harm means an injury to a person which creates a high probability of death. Instruction number 18. You have been instructed on the crimes of murder in the first degree, willful and deliberate, and murder in the second degree as charged in count 1. It is up to you, the jury, to choose the manner and order in which you deliberate on the crimes charged in count number 1. However, to return a verdict, you must follow the procedure described in the next instruction. Instruction number 19. To aid you in your deliberations in returning your verdict, you will be provided both guilty and not guilty verdict forms for each of the crimes charged in count number 1. Unless you unanimously agree on a verdict, you should not sign a verdict form for that crime. Although you may deliberate the crimes charged in count 1 in any manner and order which you may choose, you must return your verdicts for each offense charged in count 1 in the order as they are instructed. Under this procedure, if you unanimously find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree, willful and deliberate, you should sign the guilty verdict form for the offense and should not proceed to reach a verdict on the remaining offense. If after reasonable deliberation, you do not reach a unanimous verdict on murder of the first degree, willful and deliberate, you should not sign a verdict form for that offense, and you should not proceed to reach a verdict on the remaining offense.
Oh, you're so nice. Thank you.
You should only return a verdict on murder in the second degree if you unanimously find the defendant not guilty of murder in the first degree, murder and deliberate. If you unanimously find the defendant not guilty of murder in the first degree, willful and deliberate, you must sign the not guilty verdict form for murder in the first degree, willful and deliberate, before returning a verdict on any other crime charged in count 1. If you unanimously find the defendant guilty of murder in the second degree, you should sign the guilty verdict for that offense. If you do not reach a unanimous verdict on murder in the second degree, you should not sign a verdict form for that offense. Instruction number 20. In this case, as to the charge of murder in the first degree, willful and deliberate, in count number 1, there are 4 possible verdicts as to the defendant, ISAAC Sampson Apodaca. 1, guilty of murder in the first degree. 2, not guilty of murder in the first degree. 3, guilty of murder in the second degree. 4, not guilty of murder in the second degree. You must consider each of these crimes. You should be sure that you fully understand the elements of each crime before you deliberate further. You have the discretion to choose the manner and order in which you deliberate on these counts, but you must return a unanimous verdict of not guilty on murder of the first degree, willful and deliberate, before entering a verdict on murder in the second degree. You will first decide whether the defendant is guilty of the crime of murder in the first degree, willful and deliberate. Then that, if you decide that let me start that paragraph over. You will first decide whether the defendant is guilty of the crime of murder in the first degree, willful and deliberate. Then that is the only form of verdict which is to be signed as to the count. If you unanimously find the defendant not guilty of murder in the first degree, willful and deliberate, then you should sign only the not guilty form as to murder in the first degree, willful and deliberate. If after reasonable deliberation you do not reach unanimous verdict on murder in the first degree, willful and deliberate, you should not sign a verdict form for that crime, and you should not proceed to reach a verdict on the remaining crime. If you unanimously find the defendant not guilty of murder in the first degree, willful and deliberate, you will then go on to a consideration of the crime of murder in the second degree. If you unanimously find the defendant guilty of murder in the second degree, then that is the only form of verdict which should be signed. But if you unanimously find the defendant not guilty of the crime of murder in the second degree, then you should only sign the verdict form, only sign that verdict form. If after reasonable deliberation you do not reach a unanimous verdict on murder in the second degree, you should not sign the verdict form for that crime. You may not find the defendant guilty of more than one of the foregoing crimes. If you have reasonable doubt as to whether the defendant has committed any of the crimes, you must determine that the defendant is not guilty of that crime. If you find the defendant not guilty of all crimes in count 1, you must return a verdict of not guilty. Instruction number 21. In this case, there are 2 possible verdicts as to count number 2. 1, guilty, and 2, not guilty. Only one of the possible verdicts may be signed by you. If you have agreed upon one verdict, that form of verdict is the only form to be signed. The other form is to be left unsigned. Ladies and gentlemen, now the lawyers will argue the case to you. What is said in argument is not evidence. It is the opportunity of the lawyers to discuss the evidence and the law as I have instructed you. Under our rules, the state has the right to argue first. The defense may then argue, and then the state may reply. Who will close for the state?
I will, Your Honor.
You may get set up, Ms. Murphy, and then you may proceed.
I might need tech support.
Before she begins, just to kind of give you a heads up on the schedule, Ms. Murphy's going to make her closing statement to you. Then we're going to take a recess while the defense prepares, and then we'll bring you back in, and we'll hear the defense's closing statement and then the state's reply. Counsel, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I have my PowerPoint published onto the screen?
Yes.
PowerPoint.
Are the monitors up in the jury box? Okay. Go ahead, counsel.
Yeah, it looks like a pajamas or something. It's a really weird. I can't even tell what the pattern is supposed to be.
Good morning. Let me begin by thanking you again. This has been a long
No, you don't have to thank them. They are forced to be there. They don't give a shit. Just give them the closing argument.
several days. You've seen a lot of evidence. I think there's 91 exhibits, some of them with many, many photos on those discs. You've reviewed hundreds of pages of records, and you've been very attentive throughout. And we thank you for your time and attention
3 people at least have fallen asleep. They haven't been very attentive.
in this case. Let's talk about what this case is about and what the state has done to prove its burden beyond a reasonable doubt. This case is about caused, helped, encouraged. Kiara McCauley killed Grace Jennings around 1:30 in the afternoon on October 29th, 2022. After Isaac handed her the sword, it was Kiara that slashed and stabbed Grace on the bed in that garage until Grace was dead. Kiara is the principal in this case, the principal actor, but her accomplice, the partner that she was dependent on, was the longstanding architect of this murder. We know Kiara killed Grace Jennings. One, because she told us. We know that it was Kiara's DNA that could be recovered on the sword handle, and that the minor profile, the DNA that wasn't Kiara's, was also present, but it was too insufficient for further testing or conclusions. We know that Kiara's latent prints or fingerprints were the only ones that could be matched, and others were not sufficient for comparison. And we have been very clear about this position throughout the trial.
She'd been in an accident and she hadn't taken her methadone. Stop spreading lies. She was just, she hadn't slept all night. It's kind of like side eyes when she has had her mom pills, amphetamines, and she hasn't slept all night because she has insomnia. It's called amphetamines.
Kiara killed Grace Jennings. But it is not required in this case that ISAAC APODACA inflicted any injuries on Grace for him to be guilty of first-degree murder under an aided and abetted theory. ISAAC APODACA is not accused of being the one that wielded the sword.
No, the one who was awake for 4 days was the killer. The jury member who nodded off was just tired.
But as I said, he aided and abetted, or was the accomplice or the helper in this crime, and he therefore can be held to be guilty of first-degree murder. And you will have two charges in front of you with a step down as to count one. You heard the judge talk about a second-degree murder option. Today, or this morning in this first portion of my discussion with you, I'm going to focus on the first-degree murder, as from the state's perspective, that is the appropriate charge for you to return a guilty verdict on. The state is asking you to convict on that first-degree murder because the deliberate intention or the willful and deliberate planning, premeditation that is evident throughout this case shows that there was planning, conversations, forethought, all put into the murder of Grace Jennings. So let's start with a quick timeline of kind of where people are and how their bodies are moving through this case. At 11:52, we have a message from Kiara to ISAAC saying, "Did y'all just get to the garage?" From Kiara to ISAAC, referencing ISAAC and Grace. We know that Mr. Apodaca stated to Sergeant V. Hill that he thought that Grace arrived around, I think he said 11:42, or maybe it was 11:47 in the evening. At 12:04, we have the response of "I'm here." And that was Kiara after she'd left the park where she was initially waiting to initially commit this murder, or maybe take Grace into the tunnels to do it. And after the defendant changed his plan, as Kiara spoke about, she then returned back to the house. And you'll see the messages in between when you review the evidence, if you'd like, about the back and forth about just come back here. But in terms of where Kiara was at 12:04 a.m., she had moved back to the location at 5941 Jaguar from the park. At 2 a.m., there's a message telling ISAAC to go in the house for a bit, that Grace and Kiara talk for a while. We know that Kiara was really working through some mixed feelings on Grace, and in some ways felt bad for her, and in some ways was very much pulled into this homicidal delusion that Grace had somehow facilitated a gang rape of her years prior. At about 3 a.m., ISAAC asks to come back in, so we know that he returns back into the garage. And then for the next several hours, as we know, they message back and forth about how they are going to kill Grace. The final message that we know is right before the murder is from ISAAC Apodaca to Kiara on Facebook. And that's the one where he talks about she admitted it. And we know that it is the gang rape. This is kind of the final psychological blow that helps Kiara become enraged enough to finally push forward and kill Grace Jennings. At 1:34 p.m. on ISAAC Apodaca's phone that we see in the Celebrate extraction from his actual physical device, the one that was taken off of him at AP Wireless, the one that Sergeant V. Hill reviewed with him, there's a search of how to dispose of a body. At 1:42 in the afternoon, shortly after that, that's when ISAAC first calls his mom for help. He'd called her earlier about asking for a ride as part of Operation Fake Kickout, but at this point, he calls his mom for help. Now, it's been a bit of a misnomer in this case that ISAAC called 911, and let's be very clear, ISAAC Apodaca never called 911. He called his mommy, and then his mom called 911, and then dispatch called ISAAC, and he didn't answer. And then eventually, after several minutes, he called them back. But ISAAC did not go and run and ask for help from paramedics or first responders or law enforcement. His mom did. His mom is the one that kicked off the law enforcement response. Now, you're going to have a series of jury instructions. You just heard the court read them to you. And they're about as much fun to read as dishwasher assembly instructions, and about as important to this case as the nuclear codes. So, have fun digging into those, but those are your roadmap. Those are the rules handed down to you from the court on what you have to find in this case and the rules that you have to follow. After count one in the instructions, we call those the element instructions, and we'll look at them in a minute, you'll see the definition of aided and abetted. And again, I think you're picking up on this and have throughout this case, that is what the defendant is being charged with. And that instruction states that the defendant may be found guilty of a crime even though he did not do the acts constituting the crime if the state proves to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt, a doubt based upon reason and common sense, that each of the following elements. Let's look at the murder instruction. Or I'm sorry, the aided and abetted. One, the defendant intended that another person commit the crime. Well, that is plainly evident in this case. Do it, just swing and don't regret the aim. Hours and hours of texting or messaging, handing her the sword, bringing Grace over. Of course, this was intentional, and that was his goal all along. Two, another person committed the crime. Well, yep, that happened. Kiara McCauley killed Grace Jennings. And three, the defendant helped, encouraged, or caused the crime to be committed. Caused, helped, encouraged, caused. So what crime are we talking about? What underlying offense do we have to prove happened? Well, we have to prove that there was a murder, that it was a first-degree murder. Murder in the first degree, this is called the elements instruction. You'll see the 1, 2, and 3. The defendant killed Grace Jennings. Now, because of the aided and abetted instruction, this refers to the person who committed the actual crime, Kiara. But then the defendant, Mr. Apodaca, kind of stands in the shoes of Kiara under the aided and abetted theory. Kiara killed Grace Jennings. Yep. The killing was with the deliberate intention to take away the life of Grace Jennings or any other human being. We absolutely know that this was deliberate. This was intentional. This was a long, prolonged, planned event. And this happened in New Mexico on or about October 29th, 2022. I think this is probably the most undisputed element between myself and defense. We know it happened at 5941 Jaguar Drive on October 9th of 2022. We know that because of the police response, because of the autopsy, because of the messages, because of all of the evidence in this case. This happened here in the state of New Mexico on that date.
We don't care.
Now, this deliberate intention. Now, this is what sets first-degree murder apart from second-degree murder. And this is what's so important that you understand that a first-degree murder was committed in this case. So a deliberate intention refers to the state of the mind of the defendant, Kiara, in this case, because she's the actual murderer. The deliberate intention may be inferred from all of the facts and circumstances around the killing. And the word deliberate means arrived at or determined upon as a result of careful thought, such as weighing out the pros and cons, maybe thinking about which weapons to use, weighing the consideration for and against the proposed course of action. Things like, how are we going to clean up the mess? Once this happens, it cannot be undone. These are all quotes from the messages and the exchanges between Mr. Apodaca and Kiara McCauley. And all of this information reflects that deliberate intention. This was not a rash, impulsive decision. This was a calculated judgment and a decision that can be arrived at in a short period of time, but in this case, wasn't. Why do we know that? We know that Kiara had homicidal fantasies fueled by the defendant, not for days, not for weeks, not for months, but for years. She had started believing this gang rape notion and started harboring hate in her heart for Grace for a very prolonged period. And one of the ways we know that is Kiana Aguilar. Kiana Aguilar stated that she was hanging out with Kiara 6 months to a year prior to the actual murder, and that Kiara talked about a plan for her and Isaac to lure Grace over and to kill her using a sharp-bladed instrument. So this was not some unconsidered rash impulse. This was an intent to kill, and it had been building and in the works for a very, very long time. It just so happened that the night that Grace needed somewhere to stay and reached out to someone that she thought was a friend or would be helpful is the final thing that made it all possible. And as I said, there has to be this weighing or this consideration of killing and the reasons for and against such a choice. Kiara acknowledged, I thought I had reasons. I felt I had reasons to kill Grace.
I think my brother had those glasses.
And those reasons had been continually supplied and pushed and nudged by Isaac Apodaca. Count 2 is conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. The defendant and another, in this case Kiara, by words or acts agreed together to commit murder in the first degree. And the defendant and the other person intended to commit murder in the first degree, and again, this happened in New Mexico. Now, this part of the crime this crime is complete very, very early on in the evening. As they have formulated the plan, as they are continuing to work out the details, as they have brought Grace or had Grace procured, that conspiracy, that crime is complete very early on, and that's why it stands alone from the aided and abetted of the actual murder. The murder itself is not complete until Grace is dead. I think that's pretty common sense. So the conspiracy count 2 is actually kind of first in time, and then the murder, which is a long, aided, and abetted process, caused, helped, or encouraged. You're going to hear me say that a painful number of times this morning, is from the beginning throughout until Grace is no longer with us. How do we know Grace died, and how do we know that Grace was murdered? We do have to prove that a murder occurred. Well, we talked to OMI, or Office of the Medical Investigator, Dr. Emily Helmrich. She performed the autopsy, and she located significant and devastating injuries all over Grace's body. There was over a dozen stab wounds and incised wounds, incised being the slice, stabs being kind of a poke or a penetrating wound. There were some that went in Grace's back, exited out her front. These wounds, once inflicted, which would take time to inflict, given the number and the direction and the range of these different types of wounds, once the fatal wounds were inflicted, it would have taken minutes to kill Grace. And we're not able to say, is minutes more than 1 minute? Is it more than 5, or is it more than 10? We don't know. And science and medicine have limits, but we know that it would have been minutes. We know that her lungs and liver and other organs were severely damaged, and that she died as a result of sharp force injuries. The cause and manner of death was the sharp force injuries and homicide. Now, also of note are that some of the injuries, many of them the ones to the head and neck, the carotid injury, the slicing injuries kind of above the ears, a lot of those were post-mortem. So we heard throughout the case, and I don't want to go through every witness. I know you've taken notes, you've paid attention, but throughout the case, we have heard about our case agent, Sergeant Javier Vigil. Sergeant Vigil was on his way home, or about to head home after a SWAT call on October 29th, and he was the either lucky or unlucky individual to get tapped to take on this case for the Violent Crimes Unit. He responded to the scene, did a quick assessment. The scene was sealed, and then he began his interviews. He interviewed, as we know, ISAAC Apodaca, Kiara McCauley, and in the days, weeks, months, and years that have followed, he has progressively built a case that you all have seen. He executed over 15 search warrants, some for the devices that he already had consent to search, but he decided to take a belt and suspenders approach to make sure that that information could get to all of us. He executed DNA warrants, which does help us understand that Kiara was the primary individual utilizing that sword. He interviewed witnesses that didn't end up having any relevance, just to rule them out. Even though ISAAC Apodaca's confession and all of the evidence that Kiara McCauley was the killer could have potentially been a stopping point for him, he knew better and proceeded to build out a very full and very extensive case. That is why we have 91 plus exhibits to hand to you, because this was a complete and thorough investigation. As part of that investigation, he interviewed the defendant. Now, the defendant's interview, he had already been Mirandized by Cesar Ornelas at AP Wireless. But again, belt and suspenders, Sergeant Vigil Mirandized him, even though at that point, ISAAC wasn't really a suspect. They thought that this could maybe just all be Kiara. They didn't have all the information because the investigation was developing. He read him his rights. He reviewed that form with him, as he does any other witness that is in a custodial interview, or an interview where he just is concerned that maybe it'll lead to a custodial interview, one where that they may not be able to leave by the end of the interview. And over about the 2.5-ish hours of the interview, right before, ISAAC was given the opportunity to go get some water, bathroom breaks were allowed, the handcuffs were removed. ISAAC initially gave a very lengthy version of events that placed the blame solely on Kiara, implied he had no idea that the murder was going to take place. He got teary. He breathed heavily. He seemed scared and nervous, which could just be that you're interviewing with the police, and sometimes the police are intimidating. But he really drew out a lot of details about how creepy and violent Kiara was being. Details that really don't play out in the rest of the evidence in this case. For example, he said that he had a butterfly knife drug across his face. No such butterfly knife was recovered. In fact, Kiara talked about that butterfly knife and said, "Oh no, I had lost that before that night." After his lengthy version of events that fully distance himself from the crime, that fully play into this notion that he had no idea that it was going to happen. He's just a boyfriend in this house trying to navigate a complex dynamic between these two ladies. And poor him, he's so traumatized. He ultimately agrees to go through his phone. And that decision was his to make. And whether that ultimately ended up being unwise is probably pretty evident. Maybe he just thought that they were only going to look at the messages between him and Grace. We don't know, and we can't speculate why he agreed. But he did. He gave a consent to search the phone. And we see as Sergeant V. Hill sits down with him with the phone in hand as he kind of scrolls through it, and they begin talking about the messages. The messages between Kiara and Isaac, or the null void and the Froggy McCullough account, he starts reviewing them kind of about 2/3 of the way through. It appears that he starts reviewing more after the series of little dog emojis that Kiara sent about 50 pages with. But somewhere in that range, ISAAC APODACA says, everything after this isn't me. She says, okay. They go back to the beginning. Well, at the very beginning are messages that immediately began to trouble, and I think weird out, it may be the term that Sergeant V. Hill uses, things that implicate Isaac very, very early on. From the early text about bringing Grace to the
Yes, the butterfly knife is on the hot plate with the pepperoni pizza and the... What was the other dish that went missing? We never heard what happened with the pepperoni pizza and the... Was it fried chicken? No, it wasn't fried chicken. But that's where the butterfly knife is now.
the park versus the apartment, from to the final messages of, she admitted it to me. He reviewed them with him. He gave him the opportunity to explain them. He went back through from that midpoint where he started at the beginning, and then ran back through. And then eventually he confronted him with the inconsistencies that he was seeing. The defendant lied a lot in his interview. He lied about the reason for bringing Grace over, that he thought he could keep her safe. We know that the murder plot had long been in development and shifted on and off in terms of how throughout the evening. Because Kiara was already at the park when Grace was brought over. She was already dressed like a monster dude. She already had her sword with her. This plot had long been in place, and the defendant tried to lie and say that it was just to keep a friend safe. He said the conversations about cleaning up a mess were related to someone pooping in the bed that they were all laying in, and that if crime scene technicians looked through all the bedding, they would see human feces. One, those messages are plainly about cleaning up the murder, hydrogen peroxide and cold water washes to get blood and other evidence out. Two, I asked the crime scene technician about every piece of bedding that was in that garage, and none of it, thankfully, had human feces on it. You do have that evidence here. If it is bloody, and you would need to use your gloves and follow procedures to open.
No one had a Taco Bell fart in that room. X to doubt.
Open it up. But if you want to inspect those items yourself, ladies and gentlemen, they've all been admitted as evidence for you. There's no poop in the bed. He said that he didn't want, Isaac said that he didn't want.
Well, this is closing arguments. It was a lot of wasted time, and then 1.5 witness. That was interesting.
Anything to happen to Grace. But then he ultimately admitted that he did. It took a while for him to get there, but it was not the result of any coercion or threats or intimidation. It was just after being confronted with his lies over and over and over, and the nonsense that he was using to try and explain the text messages that he was clearly putting in a different context, not based on the reality of this case. He makes an admission.
Messages I just meant what I said.
So did you want Grace dead kind of because of all that?
I did.
Okay.
Did you want Grace dead because of all of that? Isaac responds, I did. He intended for the murder to happen. He's acknowledged in this case, in his statements and the messages, that he knew that Kiara had wanted to kill Grace for a very, very long time. As I mentioned, this was not a secret. Kiara said that she'd told multiple people and that she'd had lots of conversations with Isaac about it. This was not some shocking development. This was something that he had put into the works, that he was aware of, that he was facilitating. You heard some clips from some recorded conversations of the defendant while we're talking about his statements. He acknowledges in those calls that null void was one of his accounts. He tries to say that it was hacked, and there's no evidence of that. He tries to lay out a narrative that he didn't think anything was going to happen to Grace, which we know is contradicted. He said that Kiara had Russian KGB-style powers over him to trigger him, which seems nonsensical based on Kiara's testimony and appearance. It's your job to weigh the credibility of witnesses. And one of the things that you can consider is how they appear when they're testifying to you. I'm doubtful that she possesses KGB Russian spy-style skills of manipulation over someone. He insists he wasn't actually part of the planning. So this change in narrative from what he admits to in this police interview is reflective. And what does that reflect? It reflects that he's trying to shift the narrative, and how that shows how manipulative Isaac Apodaca attempts to be. He tried to manipulate, and he did manipulate Kiara. He tried to manipulate Sergeant V. Hill, and maybe it worked for a little while until the text messages were discovered, and he attempts to manipulate his mom in these recorded calls. So this case has a lot of messages, Facebook and text messages or SMS messages, ones that are sent from a phone number to a phone number, as opposed from a Facebook account to another Facebook account. Who sent them? Well, when you look, you will see that all Isaac's phone. We know that because we see Sergeant V. Hill scrolling through the Isaac's phone. We know that because we see Sergeant V. Hill scrolling through the conversation as it's housed on Isaac's actual physical device. We know from the Celebrate extraction that Facebook Messenger was being used during that entire time frame on Isaac Apodaca's phone to send Facebook messages, the ones that Sergeant V. Hill had received. So we know that there wasn't some other device that had hacked into that account. It was his phone accessing that account throughout that entire conversation. We know from the Facebook search warrant of the records as they're housed at Meta in California or wherever their servers are, that those are the conversations with identifying features that show that it was Isaac Apodaca communicating with Kiara McCauley, including that the null void account was discovered as it was linked or attached to Isaac Apodaca's other account, which was labeled Isaac Apodaca, as Sergeant V. Hill stated. And I've referenced common sense. You are individuals that we assume possess reason and the ability to utilize common sense. It would be nonsensical to believe that Kiara McCauley spent 14 hours in possession of Isaac Apodaca's phone or accessing his accounts and his phone, and was sitting there texting herself back and forth about a murder plot over the period of 15 hours with some of those messages seconds or milliseconds apart. That's nonsense. Common sense dictates that there are two individuals having those conversations, and that those two individuals are Kiara McCauley and Isaac Apodaca. And then, of course, we have Isaac's own admissions. He admitted ultimately to Sergeant V. Hill that he, in fact, was the sender. Now, this picture is on page 66 of the Facebook message return. It was sent about 5:44 a.m. In his police interview, Isaac Apodaca identifies that as himself as he's laying across the foot of the bed. And when I reference page 66, it's, if you choose to review those records, it'll be as it's notated in the top right corner of the records return, not page 66 of the PDF itself. This was sent at 5:44 a.m. from Kiara to Isaac. As we know, Isaac identified himself. And what you can see in this picture, although it's blurry, you can see Isaac Apodaca's face at about, if this was a clock face, about the 3 o'clock on the image. And what's interesting about this is that you can see there's a light coming up from below and lighting kind of the underside of his left cheek. And why is there a light there, ladies and gentlemen? Because he possessed his own cell phone during this time frame. This is one other piece of cross-corroboration that these individuals are the ones who are plotting and planning, that ISAAC Apodaca is actively participating.
As I've always said, if you can't say, closing arguments should never be more than 30 minutes long. You have had 5 days to prove the case. If you didn't do it, fuck it, you deserve him to be found not guilty. All of this yada, 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 it's a waste of time. They should not be allowed to do it. It's on the jury to find the evidence. It's not for her to tell them what they must find. She has to do it during the case. She can summarize it in the end and then send it out to the jury. I am a big no fan of closing arguments because the defense have put on nothing, and he's going to yammer on for about an hour about all the things that you can see that's not true, but he couldn't prove any of it, and they shouldn't be allowed to do that. It's for the jury to find the facts. But Baker, they're just giving you what they should pay attention to. No. They were instructed by the judge, take notes, listen to the trial, and then we're going to figure out if he's guilty. But this is complicated matters. Yeah, but that's your justice system. It shouldn't be who has the greatest closing speech who decides who gets found guilty or not guilty. My biggest pet peeve. But Baker, you don't understand. I understand it's a waste of freaking time. And it's, again, depending on who has the best orator. This is like trials in the old Rome. It was who spoke best to convince the crowd that their guy was innocent. But that wasn't looking at the facts. It's just listening to someone speaking.
He's encouraging, he's causing, he's helping. Let's talk about Kiara McCauley. I believe I told you in my opening statement that Kiara would come across as strange, as potentially kind of a broken or troubled person, and maybe as someone who would do anything for love. We know that she was 19 years old at the time of the murder. We know that they were residing in the garage because Isaac wanted her away from her mom. We know that she believed Isaac for a whole slew of reasons, including a belief that he could potentially be the Archangel Gabriel or a voice box for the Archangel Gabriel, because he knew things about her that nobody else knew. Her deepest, darkest secrets, she believed he knew. We know that his nickname for her was Puggle or Puggy. You see that throughout the messages, and that she called him Otter. Kiara came pursuant to her plea agreement, and she testified before you. As I said, the credibility of every single witness is for you to decide. And I would assert that Kiara, for all of her flaws, for all of her difficult to understand personality traits, was credible. Now, she took a plea. Kiara McCauley, and you have that plea paperwork in the exhibits, has previously pleaded guilty to aggravated second-degree murder, which is a lesser offense of count 1, and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. And I want to be really clear here. Just because she took a plea to aggravated second-degree murder, that doesn't mean that that's the crime that the only level of crime that she committed. Kiara McCauley absolutely committed first-degree murder, but in exchange, as a bargained for exchange for her cooperation, she was allowed to plead to a lesser, a step down charge. So that does not necessarily mean that she only committed aggravated second-degree murder. She didn't. She acknowledged that she committed willful and deliberate first-degree murder by talking about her reasons to do so, the planning, and all of the steps she took. This is a bargain for exchange. She also, as I said, pleaded to the conspiracy to commit first-degree murder due to the words and acts that she and Isaac engaged in to plot things. We heard from Dr. Michael Wellner, and boy, is he a talker.
So are you. Shut up.
He's an expert in forensic psychiatry, and he loves to talk about his job and all of the conclusions that he has drawn. And he gave us 3 psychiatric or psychological themes to consider. The first one is coercive control. And this relates to the research on people who are drawn into sex work by their partners. He said that as that happens, much like happened here, that Kiara was drawn into prostituting herself on Skip the Games and escort website, with ISAAC APODACA keeping the money, that a dependence forms, that the female in this case loses personal agency or their ability to make choices and determinations for themselves. They get pulled into the financial support of their partner because their partner takes the money and keeps it. It leads to dominance, a theme throughout this case. It leads to secrecy, like we see in Kiara keeping the ongoing sex work a secret from Lanny after Lanny told both her and ISAAC that the sex work had to stop. And the lead up to this coercive control dynamic is that it leads to further traumatic events. And as this goes on, the benefit throughout all of this, there's evident throughout this case, is there's a benefit to the dominant person. And there can be a economic or financial benefit, right? Your girlfriend goes and has sex for money and you take the money and are able to buy Gundam models or whatever you want with it and control.
Technical question. What if you don't have a girlfriend, but you want more Lego sets? Is there a way I could do that? Hypothetically.
Control the financial aspects of the relationship, but there's also a psychological benefit. And that's power and that's control. Now, as I said, this coercive control dynamic leads to traumatic events, and we see that in this case. We know that Kiara McCauley was sexually assaulted in the course of her sex work on Halloween of 2021. We know that because Lanny took her for her rape kit. We know that because of other statements in this case. Now, forensic psychiatry understands the notion of the idea of staying together even after a sexual assault, such as in the course of prostitution that one's partner has encouraged, or getting back together even after a violent domestic violence episode where maybe someone has their thumb broken or is beaten very badly. These encounters can lead to trauma bonding. And one of the hallmarks is that the submissive person begins to internalize or take on in their own mind, heart, body, what have you, the dominant person's perspective. Things like not agreeing to continue on with a criminal case because you don't want it to hurt your partner. And you think about the benefits or the challenges that could pose for them, as opposed to your own safety, your own security, your own health. We also heard about the term gaslighting, which is, I think, a pretty trendy term we hear a lot. I accuse my husband of it every time he leaves the toilet seat up and tells me he didn't. Apparently, I'm misusing that.
That's not gaslighting, you idiot. That's a lie. This lady is probably 15 years younger than me. This is the problem with lawyers, because I want to be funny because that'll make me feel human to people. And most of them are really dry, really boring people. So they sit at home and then they write the joke down and says, oh, what could be a fun thing? You should have gone with catfishing, because that's what we heard about. We haven't heard much about gaslighting in this trial. Go with catfishing. Call me in as an expert. I know all about it. But the thing is, when you lawyers sit at home and write, oh, I need a fun joke here to lighten the mood. The jury will love me when I do this. My husband leave the toilet seats up. I bet you got maybe half a smile on one of the jurors. If you're not naturally funny, stop trying to be funny. The problem is you're not funny. You think you're the funniest person because there was one time in law school, one person laughed at a joke that you saw on TV. You're not funny. Don't use jokes. It doesn't make you seem human.
Gaslighting is a much deeper psychological concept, and that involves convincing an individual of things that lead them to questioning their own reality, such as telling someone that you saw a video of them on the dark web of them being gang raped and an ex accepting money for it. And you begin to take on that absolutely distorted reality over the process of being gaslighted for a period of time. And we know that this coercive control dynamic, the elements of trauma bonding, and the gaslighting that went on is what fueled so much of Kiara's rage, her hatred for Grace, her conflicted feelings about Grace, because on the one hand, she still kind of loved her. On the other hand, she's grown to believe that this person is a monster who pimped her out to a bunch of men for money and is a sex trafficker. The gaslighting can lead to the belief that your individual is essentially a vigilante sex trafficking serial killer who's part or founded a group called Ghost. All of these distorted realities derive from the coercion, the trauma bonding, the control, the very toxic, I think is how Kiana Aguilar described the relationship dynamic, the dynamic that was present on October 28th into the 29th between Kiara and Isaac. So the domestic violence and the sex work are being offered to you for a very limited purpose, and you have an instruction on this. It's important that you follow that instruction and only consider this evidence for the purpose that the judge has allowed you to consider it in those instructions. It's permitted to show the defendant's intent on October 28th, 2022. So we're not saying because he beat her up in April of 2022, on that date in April, he thought, oh, 6 months from now, I'm going to be able to get her to murder someone. It's the intent on the date of the incident. Based on their past interactions, he knew what he could push Kiara to do, things that are.
Hold on a second, Counsel. Again, everyone, before we continue, please check and make sure your phones are off.
We knew that he could push Kiara to do things that an average person would not do. An average person does not hear that their partner has formed a Ghost and has a kill count of 40, and there are kill lists made for them without any sort of other corroboration or evidence, and just believes them. He knew, based on these prior experiences, what he could get Kiara to do. Things that aren't smart or in her best interest or safe. He could compel her. It's also relevant for you to consider for their relationship dynamic and how it led to this. Now, Dr. Wellner talked about a series of inducements or benefits or in a series of persuasions that are absolutely visible throughout the Facebook messages and the SMS messages. I'm not going to talk about every single one. You have those messages.
It's been 50 minutes.
Times,
Wrap it up.
or at length, excuse me. The first one is that in terms of a benefit that she would derive is that she would move up the ranks in Ghost and she would get perks on the black market. That was sent about 3:38 p.m. That's on page 37 of the Facebook records. At 5:55 a.m. on page 68 is, I just want you to do it so you can feel that rush of adrenaline. Adrenaline makes you feel good. He was trying to say, kill Grace and you'll
Boston makes me feel good.
feel better. We see that even more. So these are two of the inducements or the benefits, you know, the power, the money, the sense of belonging in this organization that she could derive. And she believed in this organization so much that she let ISAAC APODACA tattoo her with some sort of insignia or ranking symbol on her body. Persuasions.
Where else would you get a tattoo if you don't get it on your body? Don't get tattoos, kids.
He told her to use the dagger because it's blunt, and blunt cuts like butter. A little bit confusing, but it's what he said at 3:10 a.m. on page 35. The death will be instant. And this is after she said, well, will it be instant? He said, yeah. Just aim. At 3:52 a.m. on page 55 of the records, he goes into a bit hitting on the Grace gang rape fantasy delusion. She sold you into the sex trade. Just swing and don't regret the aim. This is a short list. There are dozens of examples throughout these messages of him engaging in persuasions. And what's another word for persuasions? Encouragement. Again, ladies and gentlemen, helped, caused, and encouraged. We know he helped Grace Jennings. We know he did not help Grace Jennings. We know that he helped Kiara McCauley. We know through the lens of Dr. Michael Wellner how he's able to get her to do this, how he's able to cause this murder to ultimately happen. And we know he encouraged over and over and over again. And you can see in those messages times where Kiara backs off or says, can you do it? Or what about this? She ultimately was agreeing to Operation Kickout when he sends that final message to really try and push her and then hands her the sword. Over and over again, he aids and abets the first-degree murder, and that's why he's guilty of first-degree murder. One of the ones from the text messages on the phone itself, and this is right around the time in the Facebook messages, one of them tells the other one to switch to text. You may remember that I had Sergeant Behill point that out. You'll see around 6 a.m. in the messages, which unfortunately you're going to have to work on converting from UTC to local time. There's a message that says text, like switch to text. And around that time, he states, ISAAC APODACA from his cell phone, with the dagger, bring it up, turn flat, south to north, and with hilt east to west. She says something in response, and then he says, then turn it blade east to west, hilt north to south, and voila, she dead. This reflects, again, the intentionality behind these acts. There is no doubt that they were plotting all of the different ways that they could kill Grace Jennings and all the ways that they could ultimately clean up for it. Puggle, I'm wanting you to kill her. You have to end your suffering by ending her joy. This is an explicit reference to the suffering that Kiara felt that she had suffered from Grace. At times in the messages, Kiara talks about, I'm hurting, babe. Can you please get rid of her? This is too much for me. And then at times, of course, she does actively participate because she's so tied into this delusion and the fantasy and the inducements and the persuasions. But at 6:06 a.m., Puggle, I'm wanting you to kill her. You have to end your suffering by ending her joy. There is no other way to read that message.
No, there was both a dagger and a sword. So, sometimes you need a little smaller implement because smaller can get the job done way better.
As I said, Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, we know that the defendant's intent was for Kiara to murder Grace because he told her to do it repeatedly. And he kept trying to push her buttons over and over. It's a little bit like if someone has a key ring with a bunch of keys and they're trying to undo a lock and they try the first key and it doesn't work. So they shift to the second key, it doesn't work. And they keep trying and trying and trying until they find the key and the lock catches and the door opens. He knew which keys to use, and that's because he knew her particularized psychological weak points. This was because of he was her intimate partner, and it was someone over whom he had tremendous influence, tremendous control. We know that Kiara committed the murder willfully and deliberately. It was not an accident. It was not a rash impulse. It was not heat of passion. This was a pre-planned event, and it just took the right key in the lock to finally push them through the door. We know that she had these homicidal intentions, as I stated, not for minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years. And she had begun believing that gang rape story years in advance of this. I believe she said about 6 months into dating ISAAC. That's when he began planting these seeds. We know that, as I said, she was vocal with others about it. She may have pleaded to aggravated second-degree murder, but Kiara McCauley absolutely committed first-degree murder willfully and deliberately. She premeditated it, and she had a lot of help and encouragement in getting there. Every time she resisted, every time she asked questions, every time she asked for him to help, he backs off momentarily, and then he comes back with a new key, a new approach. ISAAC APODACA brought Grace Jennings to that apartment where he resided with his homicidal, delusional girlfriend. ISAAC APODACA repeatedly urged for that murder to happen. He promised to be helpful in the charge of cleaning up. He handed Kiara the sword. He did not need to be present in the room for him to be guilty of first-degree murder. There is no requirement in the uniform jury instructions, the rules that you've been handed, that he swing that sword, that he be present in the room at the exact instance of the murder. It is about him and the ways he communicated the cause, the help, the encouragement. Ladies and gentlemen, your job is to apply the facts of this case, not to judge Kiara McCauley's culpability and then try and weigh out some sort of apples to apples decision as to, well, if she took a plea, no. Her bargain for exchange stands on its own. Your job in this case is to look at ISAAC APODACA and his role in this case, to look at ISAAC APODACA and look at all of the causation, the encouragement, the help that he performed that led to Grace Jennings dying in that disgusting garage on October 29th of 2022. And as you applied those facts, these facts, this evidence to the law in this case, you will find that he is guilty of first-degree murder under an aided and abetted theory, and you will find that he is guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. I thank you for your time and attention.
The problem is she has just bored everyone to death. No one knows what she said in the beginning. And what she said was just go back and look at the evidence. She could have done that in 15 minutes, and I hope when she gets back on her rebuttal to the state's closing that she will keep it way closer, because this is boring AF.
I'll get the opportunity to speak to you again soon.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned in between the closing statements, we're going to take a quick recess. This will be our bathroom break for the morning. We'll come.
So that was except a toilet seat and her husband doing the, oh yeah, honey, that was a funny joke. It was just, yeah, he doesn't have to swing the sword to be part of it because he's an accomplice to it. And if you're an accomplice, you get convicted in the full amount. Again, you cannot tell me this couldn't have been done in 30 minutes. There's no reasonable explanation why she bought the fuck out of everyone in that room and on the internet. I know I complain about it a lot, but it's such an American thing. The lawyers think they must talk as long as possible. This would have been way more impactful if she had kept it at 30 minutes. If she had gone up there, said yada, 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 yada. And that's why you find him guilty. And tell him to get a bath because he looks like he smells. That would have been way more impactful. I hope the defense goes up and delivers a banger 15-minute closing, because that would be way more impactful than this lady just, and you have to look at page 35 and you have to look at page 565. No one is going to look at these pages. They're going to go in there and say, oh, nice. They got a mediocre chicken palm flown in from Massachusetts. Are we going to find him guilty before or after we eat? Yeah, I'll just fill out the papers while you eat. Anyone needs a ciggy break. I believe, and I'm always wrong, I believe this verdict will be in under 2 hours. Is the jury back yet? No, we didn't get this defense closing yet. But the problem is, whenever we see these cases, is they are going over every single piece of evidence again. And that's not what a closing argument should be for. Closing argument should be the helicopter view. You don't have to say on page 333, you find this. Just give them the ghost story, give them the smecks, give them, he doesn't have to swing the sword to be an accomplice. And that's why you find him guilty. All of that is 30 minutes at most. But lawyers, they want to talk as long as possible because they think that makes me sound smart. But they are no better than when the criminals get into the interrogation room and they think, well, I can explain my way out of this. Let me just say some more. Let me say some more. Let me say some more. Let me say some more. And it's a disservice to their clients and the jury. Maybe an hour. Yeah, probably. Nah, I don't know, because they're lunchtime. It's 11 o'clock in New Mexico. I hope they'll be done by lunch. He talked about ordering food in for them. So.
Law girl, yes, girls. It's plural.
By the way, today the expert is having
New York City turned orange back in.
The expert is having a 9-hour stream because he reached 9,000 subscribers. So if I have any mods in here, can you share the link to the experts channel? He's a cool dude. Just look at him. He wears sunglasses. So I might pop on. I don't know if I'm invited to pop on, but I'm not knowing. I don't know what he's gonna do, but I might be over there later. Every lawyer thinks she's Clarence Darrow or Johnny Cochran. I know who Johnny Cochran is. No, everything is under advisement as always, but they're not going to get it dismissed. Because listening to that judge, there's no way that he's going to dismiss it. I actually think that Aiden has a better chance of getting his dismissed, but they're kind of bungled together, so but it's not going to happen, sadly. And I'm, like I said last night, I'm not impressed with Karen Reed's team. I'm really not in. Is it 4 ongoing cases she has right now? Other than Alan Jackson, I don't see the star power. I really don't see the star power. His shirt is nearly as bad as the lady's outfit that just bought us for an hour. Well, he's flamboyant. Or as they say in Irish, he's a dancing fella. Well, he hasn't invited me, so I can't go on there. Yeah, go check out the. Oh no, you can't share the link because you're not a mod. No, and again, I think we. Yeah, Joy, you can't share links in my chat because I have had troll attacks before. I think we were all expecting better because AJ was still on her team, and we were thinking, okay, at least he will wrangle up a team that's as good as maybe not as good as the team she had for the criminal trial, but at least decent. But I have been very, very disappointed with what you see out there. That's it's I don't know. Thank you, Jemima. I'm just not. But I have the same problem with them as I have with Bradle, because I think Bradle is a great personal relation to your client type of guy. But I just need 10% more in the courtroom. I need him to come in sometimes and just whip out his pimp hand and slap people across the face and say, shut the fuck up. I think he gets, maybe it's a Massachusetts thing, because everyone outside of the courtroom are calling everyone else a cunt and a son of a bitch and all of that. So maybe they're trying to make this fake, oh, we're so nice inside the courtrooms. But I need some power. I need some. That's why I love when Betterow is on, because Betterow is a I don't give a fuck kind of lawyer, where Bradle is more of a no, come on, everyone, let's just meet somewhere. And I have the same feeling with Karen's team. It's I'm just not. Yeah. Question about closing arguments. Do you mean the prosecution, defense, or both? In Karen's read, the trial lasted 6 painful weeks. Should they do a short closing and no closing? I believe both sides should be allowed 30 minutes. But Baker, they had 6 weeks of trial. Yeah. The fucking jury sat through all 6 weeks of trial. If you didn't convince them in 6 weeks of trial, you shouldn't have more than 30 minutes to try and do it. But what about all the evidence? You showed it to them. If they're not convinced when you start your closing arguments, you're not a good lawyer. I've been doing this for longer than most of these lawyers. I have never, ever, in even the most complicated cases I've had, never had a closing argument over 15 minutes. Never. If we have anything over 15 minutes, it's because it's someone who's up for deportation, because then they have to read a statute from the European human rights thingy thing. 15 minutes. I sat through the entire trial. I don't need to hear it all again. I'm not an idiot. When I went to school and people kept saying the same stuff over and over and tried to explain me how to, 2 minus 2 is 0. If you keep telling me that every day, I'm out of here. That's the reason why I stayed away around 50% of my last year in school, because it was fucking the same all the time. If you cannot explain it in 6 weeks, you're not going to explain it in 60 minutes. If you need that, you are a bad lawyer. But they're just summarizing. They shouldn't summarize anything. It's not for them to tell the jury what they should pay attention to. They have shown them through 6 weeks. This is my evidence. You shouldn't waste time on anything. Just get them the fuck out of there and send them in to deliberate. They have all the evidence they need. They don't need you to tell them what the evidence is. Yeah, and I don't like that. But some jurors are stupid, so they really want to hammer the point of your case at the end. Yeah, but that's what a jury of your peers does. Sometimes your peers are really dumb people. Trust me, go online and just open up 5 different YouTube channels and you will see there's a lot of dumb people out there. Again, if you can't explain it to them in 6 weeks, why are you allowed to determine a man's life in the last 60 minutes? You're not doing your job. Your sound is going weird, adjustment. I don't know, because I can't hear myself. My superstition. Yeah, it's easier to convince people with brevity, especially the stupid. There's not a lot that you should say about Goebbels, but Goebbels had this idea that when you make a speech, you talk to the dumbest person in the room. Because if the dumbest person understands you, the smartest person will as well. That's how you convince people, especially if you make yourself seem a little dumb, because then they will feel superior. And people like to feel superior to the speaker. Try it the next time you want something done from your husband and say, this is probably, you know so much better than me, instead of saying, can you do this? It's just like make him feel like he's smarter than you, and he will get to that honey-do list. Well, he's a nice guy. He lets me sleep with him. Well, at his house every year. Well, it's a waste of time. And I just feel that these people should respect the jury's time a lot more. Am I coming in somewhat more? I don't get that. Did they change? I just updated my CJ. That's why. No, it should automatically. That's Mike 7. Sorry. Sound settings. I'm on the right. Does this change? Is this better? Let's jump back to the old microphone. Is this better? Is this better? 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. Hola, hola. Hey, hey, hey. Hola, hola. Hey, hey, hey. Still strange. Is this better? Does it pick up better now? Is it better now? No, I was on the right microphone, but maybe I I cleaned off my microphone yesterday, so maybe I have touched something. I set everything back. You sound like I'm in a windstorm. Well, it's because I am a hurricane of energy and entertainment, and I'm just so great. Woohoo! They call me Hurricane, the little hurricane. You want to go to New Mexico? Well, I know where you can rent a garage. Right? I think it's because I needed to update my computer when you were off, and it jumped on the wrong microphone. Still not as clear and clear. Yeah, getting worse again. Where I don't get that part. Why it would get worse? Because I didn't touch anything. Maybe if I put it closer to my mouth hole, maybe I had it too low. So I'm talking over it. What's wrong with old Mexico? I don't know. I've never been there. Probably never going to go there. I saw they had a tornado in Texas. Um, Funny enough, that's Eric on one of the Von Erichs was at the Texas tornado. No, it's not better. Yes, better. In the same minute. Yes, my mouth hole. I think it's because I had my microphone too far down. So yeah, I saw there was flash flood warnings all over Texas as well. Copacabana, la 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 la, Copacabana, la 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 la. Put on my rope and deliver something that keeps us awake. Well, maybe I should take off my rope to keep you entertained. He's going to go up there and say, well, there was no proof he ever touched the sword. There was no proof he ever touched the dagger. He didn't do anything. He was a KGB plant called Maria, who was a Spanish-speaking Russian spy. And he was really afraid of the vampires in Alaska. Oh, my. Old Mexico, a.k.a. Spain. Spain is a nice place. Fedorowski is down there. So it's I don't mind going to Spain. I've been there. I think I've been to Spain 5 times or something like that. It's a nice place to go on vacation. The problem is it's so crazy hot that you cannot think when you're down there. So it's a nice place to go on vacation. Just don't stay there because it's so hot. Oh, well, I, I just wanted to take my clothes off. But can we get them back? Because my daughter just texted me if I could call her. I think Spain will win the World Cup. Well, I was rooting for France yesterday. That didn't work. So um, I don't know. I kind of like that if England would win. I think
All right.
I'm gonna go off screen and call my daughter.
You may be seated in the courtroom. We are back on the record. At this time, ladies and gentlemen, the defense, on behalf of Mr. Apodaca, has the right to make a closing statement to you. Counsel, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, thank you. We've been together now for a little over 2 weeks, if we include the initial jury selection. Do appreciate you. I've been noticing that all of you have been paying careful attention and taking notes. Last week, in opening statements, I told you that you would hear some testimony and see some evidence, but what you would not see is anything directly linking ISAAC APODACA to the crimes charged in this particular case. I do want to say one thing before I start with my presentation. Normally, I do like to kind of get up close and personal, walk around and talk to you and kind of looking more directly in the eye, but because of the circumstances of this case and media involved and different things, I am limited to the podium. But the good thing about that for me is that I can kind of stay on script, and I have my script here. So I'm going to try not to go into too many asides and really just go into the important details of this particular case. This is, of course, a serious case. And you heard Ms. Murphy state that there were homicidal fantasies fueled by ISAAC. That's what the state told you in their opening statement. Well, or closing statement. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence shows something totally different. The evidence shows that Kiara acted alone, and the government has not proven that Mr. Apodaca in any way was a knowing participant. And I'm going to go into that and I'm going to outline that. ISAAC did not cause, aid, or encourage this killing by Kiara McCauley to take place, as the state would like you to believe, and as Ms. Murphy pointed out that you're going to hear a lot about cause, aid, or encourage. Well, that's not what happened here. The burden and presumption is that ISAAC is presumed innocent, and the burden remains on the state at all times. Reasonable doubt is a doubt based on reason and common sense, and I'm sure you will employ your common sense when making your determinations here today. Attorney statements alone are not evidence. The evidence is testimony, exhibits, and stipulations. ISAAC is presumed innocent until the government proves every required element of the crimes beyond a reasonable doubt. And ISAAC has no burden to prove his innocence. It's on the state, and the state has to prove every element. Reasonable doubt may arise from what the evidence shows and from what the evidence does not show on material points. And as you'll see here, there are a lot of material points that does not point towards ISAAC's guilt. The absence of DNA, fingerprints, blood, injuries, planning evidence, and conduct consistent with guilt is significant here. And it is reasonable doubt, clearly. You know, I kind of made that cheesy line in opening statement about I'm not going to stand up here like a used car salesman. The reason I brought that up was only to prove to you that I don't have to sell you on reasonable doubt in this case. It's clear. So I'm going to show you some jury instructions that you're going to go back into the jury room to go over. This will be jury instruction 3. You are the sole judges of the facts in this case. It is your duty to determine the facts from the evidence produced here in court. Your verdict should not be based on speculation, guess, or conjecture. Neither sympathy nor prejudice should influence your verdict. You are to apply the law as stated in these instructions to the facts as you find them, and in this way decide the case. Speculation, guess, or conjecture. You heard Ms. Murphy recap the state's case and discuss a lot of stuff about ISAAC, but you also heard the testimony. And everything here is based on speculation, guess, conjecture in regards to some messages and perhaps some statements that Mr. Apodaca was coerced into adopting when a talented detective, Detective Vigil, cleverly framed a narrative for him to adopt. Another instruction you're going to have is instruction number 6. You alone are the judges of the credibility of the witnesses and the weight to be given to the testimony of each item. You able to see that clearly? Okay. In determining the credit to be given any witness, you should take into account his or her truthfulness or untruthfulness, his or her ability and opportunity to observe, his or her memory, his or her manner while testifying, any interest, bias, or prejudice he or she may have, and the reasonableness of his or her testimony considered in the light of all of the evidence in the case. Now, us attorneys like to use the word reasonable and reasonableness, but you heard, I mean, there were several witnesses who came here. There were some people who clearly had a bias. Lainey McCauley, and we're going to get into Ms. McCauley's testimony and what she said when I recap and get into the specifics, the meat and potatoes, so to speak, of what was going on. But Lainey McCauley certainly was here to protect her daughter. She loved her daughter and was concerned about her daughter and said what would suit her. And then you had other witnesses, certainly Kiara McCauley, and I'm sure you paid attention to that, the direct examination of the state of Ms. McCauley and my cross-examination, but there were several inconsistencies. I'll get into the details, and she was prepped and had many different interviews, both with the state as well as police and her attorneys. But you have to look at the credibility, including opinions by experts. Dr. Waldner, we'll get into him, certainly a character, but you really have to look at what he testified to and what the weight of his testimony, whether it really is legitimate. Instruction number 10. You should consider each opinion received in evidence in this case and give it such weight as you think it deserves. If you should conclude that the reasons given in support of the opinion are not sound, or for any other reason an opinion is not correct, you may disregard the opinion entirely. I think that's important when we're looking at all of the witnesses, and there were several opinions that were presented. Now, the state has to prove all of the elements of the crimes beyond a reasonable doubt, as we discussed in jury instructions. The first charge is for you to find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree, willful and deliberate, as charged in count 1. The state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. Defendant killed Grace Jennings. I'll acknowledge the state is trying to proceed here on accomplice liability. All right. But the defendant, as is agreed between us, one thing we'll agree with the state on, the defendant did not physically stab Grace Jennings to death. That was Kiara McCauley. So now we're basing everything on some messages, maybe a statement he made to the Detective Vigil, and just various other circumstances and testimony. And then this grand old narrative by Dr. Wellner, who I'll get into more later, but Dr. Wellner didn't even sit down and discuss this with Mr. Apodaca or with Ms. McCauley. And the importance of that is that when you're trying to form an opinion, don't you have to form that opinion, especially when you're doing an expert opinion on matters such as coercion and control between two different individuals? Don't you have to sit down and talk to them up close and personal, know what's going on, know their, different quirks or different things that might make them susceptible or maybe not prone to coercion and control, or vice versa? How do we know that Kiara McCauley was not coercive and controlling over ISAAC Apodaca? what evidence do we have one way or the other? What was going on? Actually, we have evidence through testimony and different things that Kiara was kind of running the ship. And Lainey McCulley, her mom, somewhat controlling and kind of her mentor, raised her around swords and was a mentor to her. And Kiara actually lived out her fantasy, had a dream. She described the sword as being this beautiful sword. Element 2, the killing was with the deliberate intention to take away the life of Grace Jennings or any other human being. There's nothing here showing that Isaac Apodaca had any sort of deliberate intent, and I will get into the accomplice liability instruction here shortly. And then this happened in New Mexico on or about October 29th, 2022. We're not denying that the killing took place on October 29th, 2022. Now, the accomplice liability instruction, again, it says that the defendant intended that another person commit the crime. Did this defendant intend for Kiara McCulley to commit this crime? There's been absolutely no evidence beyond some crazy text messages that I'm going to get into and break down here that Isaac Apodaca intended for Kiara McCulley to commit this crime. Another person did commit this crime. We're acknowledging that Kiara McCulley committed this crime. And then the defendant helped, encouraged, or caused the crime to be committed. There's absolutely nothing. And I want you to carefully look over those messages. And I'm going to go over some of the messages, some of the specific messages, and explain to you why there's nothing showing that the defendant helped, encouraged, or in any way certainly caused this crime to be committed. Now, one thing that's important for you to, well, for me to discuss is if you find the defendant, find the defendant not guilty of first-degree murder, then there's his instruction as to second-degree murder. We don't believe defense, and I think it'll be pretty clear when you start deliberating that Mr. Apodaca is not guilty of murder at all here. But you do have to consider, and I do have to show you this, the instructions for second-degree murder. And this takes out the deliberate intent portion of the analysis. So the defendant killed Grace Jennings. The defendant knew that his acts created a strong probability of death or great bodily harm to Grace Jennings. Now, you know, I do have the plea up here, and I'm going to show that to you in a bit, but Miss McCulley's plea was to second-degree murder. And certainly she knew that there was a strong probability of death or great bodily harm to Grace Jennings. But nothing here shows that the defendant in any way had anything to do with wanting Grace Jennings dead and intending for this to happen. And then we would, of course, go back to the accomplice liability jury instructions in regards to encouraging and causing. And then there's also a charge of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, willful and deliberate, as charged in count 2. The state must prove to your satisfaction, beyond a reasonable doubt, each of the following elements of the crime. The defendant and another person, by words or acts, agreed together to commit murder in the first degree. The defendant and another person intended to commit murder in the first degree, and this happened in New Mexico on or about October 29, 2022. Absolutely nothing showing that the defendant intended to commit murder in the first degree and that there were words and acts as far as any sort of legitimate agreement. Okay, so I wanted to just go over those jury instructions with you because I think it's important for you to kind of understand when you're doing your analysis. But it's going to be pretty straightforward, as I'm pretty sure you will realize when you get to the deliberation room. Now, I do think it's important to show you this because there's a jury instruction in regards to how intent could be formed and different things. And then with Dr. Wellner and the state has harped on this April 2022 dismissed charge. And I did introduce this, and this clearly shows that that was dismissed. And I think it's also important for you to understand that when you're evaluating Dr. Wellner's testimony. Because Dr. Wellner has no idea of the context of what was going on in April of 2022, other than his file review and testimony. I mean, pretty much he's regurgitating what was said, and he was, of course, paid, flew in here from Palm Beach, Florida, by the state, travels the country to testify when he's paid. And then he wants to make this grand analysis. The case in April 2022 was dismissed, and there is nothing anywhere in Dr. Wellner's analysis that can demonstrate that he actually knew what the context of that dismissal was and what was going on there. And then there was, of course, Kiara's plea, and she pled to second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. And she had an incentive here to testify against Mr. Apodaca. Now, in regards to the conspiracy and the actual charge of murder, there was no proof, absolutely no proof, that Isaac was present for the killing. The case agent admitted no evidence that Isaac was in the garage when Grace was killed, and there was no evidence presented through any other witness. Isaac had no blood on him, no cuts on his hand. Sergeant Vijo couldn't remember any cuts on his hand, and there was no evidence of that. And there were no blood. There was no blood on Mr. Apodaca's clothes. I think this is very important. I mean, don't you think with all that bloodshed and everything going on in there, that there would be some blood on Mr. Apodaca? No, absolutely none. Lainey McCauley didn't witness the garage events, did not see anyone being harmed by Isaac, had no personal knowledge of what happened in that garage. Lainey did not know whether the garage door was locked that morning. Kiara and Grace had a deteriorated relationship. Lainey agreed on the stand that Grace could easily provoke Kiara. The sword was associated with Kiara's Amazon account, and Kiara opened it in front of her mom. Everyone touching the sword when it arrived, but there's no fingerprints or any DNA linking Mr. Apodaca to the sword. Kiara McCauley's credibility before you here yesterday was like a lot longer than that, but here yesterday, her credibility is next to nil. She attributed extraordinary beliefs to Isaac, including that he was the Archangel Gabriel, and made wild statements that Isaac discussed a group called Ghost and described Ghost as a vigilante group that killed people who they considered to be bad. This, ladies and gentlemen, was absolutely ridiculous. Those claims may explain Kiara's current narrative, but they do not eliminate any sort of reasonable doubt as to Mr. Apodaca's involvement. Messages here do not equal proof beyond a reasonable doubt. State will rely on Facebook Messenger communications. Even if some of the messages were sent from Mr. Apodaca's account, the legal question here remains intent, assistance in any sort of agreement in regards to both counts. Isaac told police that some messages were sent by Kiara using his account from a second phone. They located a second phone, but nothing was removed from that extraction. Sergeant Vigil testified that the state later relied on Facebook records and phone logs to connect messages to Isaac's phone. You may consider that, but it's still not proof that every element was met beyond a reasonable doubt. In regards to investigation gaps, there were blood on the door. I asked Mr. Vigil about that, Detective Vigil, excuse me, if the house was, the blood on the door to the house was DNA tested, and it was not. The garage was messy, and it was basically an investigative decision not to leave every stone unturned. I mean, no stone should be unturned in an investigation like this, but a lot of evidence was not tested or even looked at. In a case like this, it's very important that all of the evidence is properly looked at. Ms. McCauley stated in her testimony that she could not hear screaming from the garage because it was 27 feet away.
Sir, I need you to sit down.
Okay. This tape measure is about 8.5 feet long. So we would be talking about from this door, from the door over here to right about here. We're talking 8.5 feet. If you multiply that by 3, I am pretty decent at math, even though I'm a lawyer, but 8.5 by 3, that would be about 25.5 feet. You need about another 1.5 feet. So you're talking here, times 2 would be up to there, times 3 would be probably where y'all are sitting, and then maybe another foot or 2 would be the next row back there. So we're supposed to believe that Lady McCauley could not hear her daughter, Kiara McCauley, stabbing Grace to death with a sword which has her DNA on it. Right middle finger, DNA right here, palm right here, on the left-hand side, holding it like this, at the very least, and then certainly she was stabbing Miss Jennings to death for 2 minutes. Let's take 2 minutes off the clock. It's 11:55. Stay silent till 11:57. All right, 11:57, 2 minutes. That was a long 2 minutes. Some of you didn't fall asleep there, but imagine those 2 minutes. 27 feet away. So we're talking basically from that door, roughly to the top row where you're sitting. And Kiara is actively stabbing Grace to death. You don't think that there was screaming. that there were loud noises. And during all this time, Ms. Lainey McCulley, who clearly has a reason to protect her daughter, says she didn't hear anything. I remember Isaac called his mom, who called 911, and Isaac waited at the AP wireless store and was extremely cooperative with authorities. These gaps matter, ladies and gentlemen, because the state is asking you to reconstruct, essentially circumstantially saying whether Mr. Apodaca somehow had intent or timing, presence, and participation, none of which is present here. Sergeant Vigil, in regards to the interrogation, relied, but I'm not picking on Detective Vigil, excuse me. I mean, I think he's very talented at what he does, but these interrogations are not reliable. Common tactics. I asked Dr. Wellner. He did provide some decent insight maybe into coerced interrogations, coerced confessions. I don't know necessarily Mr. Apodaca confessed, but he may have adapted to some of the stuff that Detective Vigil was talking about, because he just, I mean, he was basically told to accept this narrative. And he didn't really feel like he had any other choice but to accept that narrative. Isaac cooperated, he answered questions, did not ask for counsel, he did not become confrontational. Sergeant Vigil had also told Isaac that he was going to go to jail before interviewing Kiara and before completing the investigation. Sergeant Vigil used pressure statements. You can hear from you can play that when you're in the deliberation room. Probably heard it when we were, when it was played before you. But Sergeant Vigil used pressure statements such as, "Dude, I'm not dumb, and it's over, own it." Sergeant Vigil at that time did not know whether Isaac was sleep deprived. He did not ask about medications or medical diagnosis. He was not trained to recognize psychological stress. He did not ask about education or reading difficulty or disabilities for that matter. Interrogation may show pressure and confusion, but nothing there properly states that Mr. Apodaca was in any way accepting anything in regards to responsibility in this case. He was just pressured into accepting a narrative. And the state also wants to make this whole argument about coercion and control. You saw him on that interview. Did he seem coercive and controlling at all? I mean, I hate to say this, but I think we're in the middle of July. I know it's a little cooler here in Santa Fe than other parts of the country, but Isaac couldn't sell me a free air conditioner in the middle of July. I mean, he is not coercive or controlling. He's not demonstrated any of those traits. I mean, if anything, he was just scared and didn't know what to do, and was just kind of agreeing with this narrative that Detective Vigil was shoving down his throat. Now, as far as the forensics, Dr. Helmer did prove that there was a homicide. She did explain that. She didn't say anything about Isaac's guilt. Grace had more than 20 sharp force injuries, but pathology did not identify Isaac as a killer. Dr. Helmer could not determine the exact time of death scientifically, but stated that it took around 2 minutes. The pronounced time of death, I mean, it was not the actual time of death, she wasn't sure, but Sergeant Vigil admitted that he didn't do any independent forensic analysis to determine how long the attack took, and he kind of just told Isaac, oh, it wasn't 30 seconds to 2 minutes, and Isaac just was basically admitting to anything that Detective Vigil was telling him. But Emily Helmer, the witness, clearly testified that it did take about 2 minutes. This case, ladies and gentlemen, is about proof. It's not about suspicion. Again, guess, conjecture, speculation. That's not what it's about. It's not about suspicion. Case is not about whether something terrible happened to Grace. It did. Case is about whether the government proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Isaac knowingly took part in it. The evidence points towards Kiara, her sword, her jealousy, as we'll get into, her planning, her hands, her DNA, her fingerprints, her flight, her cleanup, and her ultimate rage that had been building up for many, many months and years. Evidence does not point to Isaac Apodaca. This is a tragedy, but it's not proof of anything involving Mr. Apodaca. State proved, we'll acknowledge, and I told you this in opening, that some of our arguments kind of overlap. The state did prove that Grace Jennings died by homicide. It did not prove, the state did not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Isaac Apodaca is legally guilty of first-degree murder or an accessory to any sort of murder or guilty of any sort of conspiracy. The case agent admitted no evidence, Detective Ehill, no evidence has been presented that Isaac was in the garage when Grace was killed. Isaac had no blood on him, no cuts on his hands that Sergeant Vihil could remember, and no blood on his clothes. Lainey McCulley did not witness the garage events, did not see Isaac harm anybody, and had no personal knowledge of what happened in that garage. Lainey did not know whether the garage door was locked that morning. Now, Kiara and Grace had a deteriorated relationship. Lainey agreed. She testified that Grace could easily provoke Kiara. The sword was associated with Kiara's Amazon account, and Kiara opened it in front of her mom, Lainey. As far as Kiara's credibility is concerned, I mean, you heard her testify. She had, again, the Archangel Gabriel, the vigilante group. I mean, this is all ridiculous. Absolutely no evidence was presented of any sort of group, let alone ghost group or any of that, let alone any of this being discussed between Isaac and Grace. I mean, those claims may explain Kiara's current narrative, convenient narrative, whatever you want to call it, but they do not eliminate reasonable doubt when it comes to Mr. Apodaca. Kiara had always liked swords. Kiara's mother was a member of a medieval sword club. Kiara grew up around a strong woman. Lainey, I think we can agree that her mom was a strong person, saw how she testified. Isaac, on the other hand, needed a place to crash, needed a place to stay, and he was at their mercy. Needed to agree with anything that Lainey and Kiara wanted. Needed to acquiesce. And again, I keep, now they use the word acquiesce. Mere presence. And you can't prove accomplice liability merely by presence or acquiescing. It has to be based on the elements that are presented to you. So it's important to ask, where is Mr. Apodaca in all this? Again, the weapon, Kiara's DNA and fingerprints were clearly present on the sword, as Emily Helmer testified to, Dr. Helmer. Isaac's DNA and fingerprints were completely absent. He was calm, cooperative, somewhat, until, I mean, certainly he was nervous and disturbed about what happened, but he was certainly shaken up about what happened around him, but there was absolutely no blood on Mr. Apodaca. There were no cuts, no scratch. I mean, there was the little scratch that Mr. Apodaca described was a product of Ms. McCulley poking him with the sword, but there were no significant injuries indicative of any sort of bloodshed that would be, or a byproduct of anything that would be a result of a stabbing of that nature. Now, again, DNA, as I showed you, was present on the sword handle. Kiara's fingerprints were present on the sword handle. Grace's DNA was present on blood stains from the actual blade of the sword. Isaac's DNA was not present on the sword. Isaac's fingerprints were not present on the sword. And based on fingerprints and DNA results, Kiara would have had to have handled the sword with both hands, as I demonstrated to you when they're showing the right middle finger and the left palm. I mean, Isaac's DNA and fingerprints were virtually absent from all critical evidence in this case. His fingerprints were not found on the sword sheath, dagger, or dagger sheath. His DNA was eliminated from the sword blade, Grace's blood, sword handle, the blue sweater with Grace's blood on the cuff, the tissue with Kiara's blood, all of the wall and bedding swabs with Grace's blood, and most critically, from both of Grace's fingernail clippings, including the DNA under the fingernails. So there was nothing linking Isaac Apodaca. And I think it's also important to note that Kiara had all these conflicting, crazy stories, right? She's talking about how Isaac had handed her the sword at once. I mean, she had a more trimmed down testimony here when she testified before you, but then I talked to her about her previous interviews and different wild accusations she made about Isaac handling the sword or swinging the sword or different things. But as the evidence played out and as she was prepared either for trial or for interviews as they progressed, she changed. I mean, initially she talked to the officers or Detective Vigil without her attorney present. She didn't have an attorney at that time. And she didn't really say anything about Isaac. Then she was charged, and all of a sudden she has these wild allegations against Mr. Apodaca. Wild stories. And of course, she conveniently took a plea right after that. And she had her attorneys present with her during that interview. And then the third time, in the third interview, with myself present here in actually this very courtroom, I believe, and Mr. Meek, my investigator, present, she toned that back a little bit. And then before you here yesterday, she had another trim version after she was prepared to testify before you. And then the drinking. She had initially said that she had a few sips of alcohol. Then actually, when she had her attorneys present and she was talking to the state right before she took a plea agreement, she said she drank 1.5 bottles of Jack Daniels. Okay. I don't know. I'm not an expert on alcohol use. I hope I'm not, but I mean, I would think that 1.5 bottles of Jack Daniels over the course of a day is an extreme amount of alcohol. How can we believe that she remembers anything? Oh, my doctor testified that Grace was underweight and was about 111 pounds, I think. 111 pounds, 5'9" 1.5 bottles of Jack, or I don't know, or initially she said a few pints right before she got arrested, or a few sips, excuse me, and then yesterday she said a pint. Ladies and gentlemen, jury, her testimony cannot be taken seriously at all. It's completely contradictory between every interview she did, and likelihood is she may just have been really, really drunk. I don't know. Maybe that would explain why she stabbed somebody to death several times. I mean, someone with a deep level of anger like that must have come with an extreme level of provocation. Now, CSS Tenna did a great job with the forensic report. You saw that with the forensic work, and did not put Isaac's DNA on the sword or anything that links him to this killing. As far as Kiara's, again, no blood on Isaac. As far as the bloodshed, there were no Band-Aids on Isaac. A Band-Aid box was found in the detached garage. Kiara had Band-Aids on her. That evidence is consistent with Kiara handling the weapon, not Isaac. State's trying to point and basically paint Isaac in the worst light possible, but there's absolutely no evidence of him having any sort of involvement in this case. Kiara was the one who discussed this big, or maybe she didn't say big, but she said beautiful sword. Stated that her mom taught her how to use swords, and then she lived out her fantasy after getting her own sword. Kiara's mom, again, was a part of these sword clubs, and Kiara testified that her mom was almost like a mentor to her. So basically, it comes down to this. I mean, the sword is the central object in this killing. Kiara's on the sword, Grace is on the blade. Isaac is nowhere to be found as far as any sort of DNA or anything. Motive and rage belong to Kiara here. Kiara was jealous of Grace and Isaac. Kiara acted out of rage and extreme provocation by Grace. Grace had provoked Kiara over the years. And Kiara told Grace to apologize as she stabbed her to death. And that's also important to note. When you're standing over, I'm not going to be dramatic with the sword in regards to this, and it's the serious stuff. But, I mean, Kiara is standing over Grace, asking her to apologize. I think you need to think about that for a second. If they're saying that ISAAC APODACA somehow coerced and controlled or caused Ms. McCauley to do this, are we supposed to believe that when she's basically standing over her with a sword and telling her to please apologize, and then she'll stop? I want you to think hard and deep about that. I mean, using a sword, as my co-counsel, Mr. Cameron, pointed out, I mean, using a sword in this case demonstrated that Kiara was up close and personal with Grace. It's not like somebody's shooting a gun from a distance or anything like that. It's up close and personal with this sword. You're stabbing somebody in close range. I can't stab you from over here. I can throw a sword at you, but I can just stab you from over here like I could shoot you with the gun. Sword killing is an intimate, violent, and personal act. Post-mortem wounds. Mr. Cameron also got into that. According to OMI, all 7 wounds on the head and neck were post-mortem after death. OMI testified that the post-mortem wounds could have also killed Grace had she been alive. Ladies and gentlemen, this killing took place with so much rage, so much anger, so much passion by Ms. McCauley. And how are we to believe that Isaac somehow coerced and controlled her to do this? It's ridiculous. It doesn't add up. Kiara's contradictions and Lainey McCauley's motive to protect her daughter. They were the ones who orchestrated, Lainey McCauley did not orchestrate this, but clearly they were the ones who were coercive and controlling over Mr. Apodaca. Mr. Apodaca may have just been maybe sending some messages in agreement or whatever because he just needed a place to crash. And of course, let's get to Dr. Wellner. Dr. Wellner is a red herring in this case, ladies and gentlemen. He's a red herring. The case, we believe, is a weak case for the state. The state is trying to make you believe that Isaac was somehow coerced and controlled. Or somehow coerced and controlled Ms. McCauley. So then they bring in Dr. Wellner. The government wants to explain all of this bloodshed, the state, through this coercion and control. The sword, the DNA, the fingerprints, the band-aids, the washer still running, the flight, the jealousy, the post-mortem wounds, point to Kiara acting alone. Physical evidence, again, does not put Isaac on the sword. Isaac had no blood on him. Isaac had no real cuts. Kiara ran while Isaac cooperated. Kiara had the sword, the motive, the planning, the DNA, the fingerprints, and the rage. Dr. Wellner's so-called expert testimony, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, should be taken with a grain of salt. And I don't know if he's an expert. I understand that. But as I told you earlier, travels the country. He was flown in here from Palm Beach, Florida, testify for the state. He was paid by the state to make this argument without interviewing the subjects of this situation without looking into or finding out any real detail about that 2022 case that was dismissed. And then he also goes into this analysis about the stuff about, you know, all this stuff, the sex work and all this stuff. Those are all red herrings, ladies and gentlemen. None of that should be considered. I mean, it's not an instruction. Again, there's also an expert opinion jury instruction. And it's up to you to determine the weight that deserves. And I'll tell you this, Dr. Wellner's testimony deserves absolutely no weight. So, ladies and gentlemen, I mean, the government did not prove that Isaac committed the crimes alleged here. Kiara ordered the sword. This was a result of jealousy. Suspicion is not proof. Association is not proof. Being near Kiara is not proof. Again, mere presence is not alone. Joking around is not proof. I don't want to use the term hyperbole, but I mean, there are certainly, you know, we can't really take these messages. We got to take the messages in its proper context. I mean, Grace Jennings was Isaac's ex-girlfriend with whom he maintained a friendly relationship. Grace proactively contacted Isaac seeking a place to stay, welcomed her into their house. There was really no evidence of any real pre-existing conflict between Isaac. There was certainly pre-existing conflict between Kiara and Grace, but nothing between Isaac. So, I mean, I guess there was, I mean, you can talk about real world intent and these text messages, text-based puffing. I mean, in the text stream at 12:54 a.m., Isaac explicitly told Kiara in the text stream to show compassion and reject violence. Then there's that bizarre message about, I mean, that the state wants to talk about with moving up the rank, the black market heads and Bitcoin payouts and all of this. I mean, that's just basically an echo chamber. It's not anything that's legitimate in regards to any sort of intent that Mr. Apodaca had in regards to do anything towards Ms. Jennings. Isaac explicitly texted at 5:59 a.m. Yes, I want to help. But I cannot coach you to do. But then he backed out. He said, she has a volatile partner. She's going through delusions. It's basically telling her what she wants to hear. She's like, I cannot aid you. He doesn't want anything to do with this. Isaac generally tried to de-escalate the matters and discussed a nonviolent strategy. I mean, the text messages, I'm not gonna sugarcoat them. They're certainly disturbing, especially considering what happened here. But there's nothing showing that these messages was any sort of legitimate acknowledgement by Mr. Apodaca that he was intending, encouraging, or causing, as Ms. Murphy articulated, there was nothing that he was intending, encouraging, or causing Kiara to commit the crime. And again, ladies and gentlemen, remember, mere presence or acquiescence alone is not enough to find somebody guilty of murder as an accomplice. This was about Kiara's beautiful sword. This was Kiara's plan, Kiara's jealousy, Kiara's rage, Kiara's flight, Kiara's cleanup, Kiara's DNA, Kiara's fingerprints. This had absolutely nothing to do with Isaac's knowing participation. No proof beyond a reasonable doubt was clearly presented here. So, the state, they did prove a tragedy here. They did prove suspicion, but they did not prove that Isaac Apodaca is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Only verdict here, ladies and gentlemen, is not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of second-degree murder, and not guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. The state is asking you to ignore essentially what is missing in this case and look away from what is present. for you to determine whether somebody is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, you have to look at the evidence, but also the absence of evidence, which is very glaring in this case. Only verdict here, ladies and gentlemen, is, again, not guilty of all the counts. Thank you for your time. And on behalf of my defense team, Mr. Cameron, Mr. Apodaca, and Mr. Meek, we appreciate the work that you've done and you're putting into this case. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, under our rules, because the state bears the burden of proving the charges beyond a reasonable doubt, the state has the opportunity to do a reply after the defense's closing statement to you. Ms. Murphy. Before you get started, if you want to stand up and stretch for a second, we're going to finish this before we take our next break. All right, counsel, I think the jury's ready. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Hello again. Let me start with the first thing that I think defense and I agree on. Kiara committed first-degree murder. She willfully and deliberately killed Grace Jennings. That does not seem to be a point in contention in this trial, nor has it ever been. Kiara committed first-degree murder. That is not your job to sort out. It's a fact. Your job is to sort out ISAAC Apodaca's culpability. That culpability is that he aided and abetted that first-degree murder. He's absolutely presumed innocent until proven guilty, and it is absolutely our burden to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, a doubt based upon reason and common sense. And we have given you ample evidence that exceeds that high burden. Defense continues, and I'm going to jump around a little bit. This is a direct response to the defense closing, so bear with me. But defense continually couched ISAAC as being cooperative. And I would assert that that's extraordinarily incorrect. ISAAC fled the scene. He called his mom and not law enforcement. And then he spent the next several hours lying repeatedly to law enforcement in a demonstrable way. That's not cooperation, that's manipulation. It was an attempt to remove himself from the spotlight once he realized that Googling how to dispose of a body wasn't going to give him the information he needed to, in fact, help dispose of the body, the thing that he'd agreed to do prior in the night. Once he realized that wasn't going to work out, ISAAC put ISAAC first, and he bounced. Defense talked about Lanny McCauley and said that she was only here to protect Kiara McCauley. Kiara McCauley's case is done. She has taken a plea. And as long as she cooperates and doesn't lie, her sentence is set. Lanny said, I'm here to protect myself, thank you very much. And Lanny didn't hear any evidence of the murder. Neither did the neighbors. The police checked. This was a decent amount of distance, an insulated garage. You can actually see the insulation rolls in some of the photos, an insulated home. And even if you could hear over the TV that was usually kept loud, ISAAC was with her, other than when he went to go number one, I think is what he called it, to pee. So either ISAAC's in the house also hearing someone get murdered and doing nothing, or no one could hear it inside the house, or at least Lanny couldn't. But ISAAC still knew what was going on because he had put everything into play. Defense asserted that there is no evidence beyond the messages in this case, and the messages are absolutely damning and they're absolutely relevant. We also have the defendant's admissions, Kiara McCauley's testimony, which is evidence. Testimony of civilians or individuals is yours to weigh out, but it is evidence just like any other kind of evidence that you get to weigh and determine the strengths and weaknesses of it. And Dr. Wellner's perspective, and defense just spent some time kind of more or less asserting that Dr. Wellner might be a quack, when in reality, Dr. Wellner has spent the last 30 years in the field of forensic psychiatry, has testified nationally both for the prosecution and the defense, and that he followed the best practices in his field for doing a case review. He reviewed all of the underlying data, which included the April 4th, 2022 case file, which he had acknowledged that he had reviewed. He uses data to reach evidence-based conclusions. Research, he relied on research in talking about coercive control, trauma bonding, and gaslighting. Defense said that in talking about the second-degree murder, talked about the actions that could create a strong probability of death. And it's important that we understand why this is a first-degree murder and not a second-degree murder. Someone picking up a gun and shooting in the general direction of another individual creates a strong probability of death, but it doesn't necessarily mean they've reached the deliberate intention to kill. They've weighed out all of the factors contained within forming that deliberate intention. Here, we don't have that. We have a prolonged, and we felt what a 2-minute period could feel like, prolonged attack using a pre-planned weapon with the aid of a co-conspirator and a co-defendant. It took minutes to carry out, and that minutes is actually the amount of time it took her to die after the injuries were inflicted. So it's going to be a longer period because we know this wasn't a single shot fired. This is multiple slashes and stabs. It was not instant, like Isaac promised Kiara it would be. Defense stated that the interrogation that Sergeant Vigil, who's been trained in some particularized techniques, was not reliable, and that's just not borne out in the evidence. Dr. Wellner, who has testified on false confessions and coercion and that subject matter, defense was the one who questioned him about it, said there were no elements of a coerced confession here, that the techniques that he was continually pressed on, oh, did you use minimization, maximization, or over amplification? No. Did you develop a narrative in advance that you just pushed throughout? No. Sergeant Vigil spent the first hour and a half plus just listening to Isaac talk and asking follow-up questions. There was no narrative at play. He was information gathering. He was on a truth-seeking mission. Isaac at one point in those messages says, or in his interview, with Sergeant Vigil, I was just sending those messages in correspondence. Really? Because it sounds like the defense couched it as joking around, saying, Puggle, I'm wanting you to kill her. Saying, she sold you into the sex trade. Talking about which weapon to use, how to use it, north, south, east, west, voila, she dead. Telling her that she had multiple personalities and to try and summon the angry one. That doesn't sound like jokes. That sounds like inducements and persuasion. Defense and I agree on a second point, that this was a murder that took anger and rage and passion to eventually access. And that had been fomenting or building over a period of years. There wasn't this initial bout of rage when Kiara first saw Grace, and they actually even spent some time talking in the garage together. It was an untapped resource, but that had been building and been fueled over a prolonged period of time. And who was providing that fuel? ISAAC APODACA. When Kiara first met Isaac at the mall and Grace was there, she didn't see Grace and have some epiphany that she'd been gang raped. No, it was once she started dating ISAAC APODACA, 6 months in, he started telling her about it. He spent years cultivating this narrative. He spent years pressing for this to happen. And he finally had an opportunity to get Kiara to execute it. And the psychological benefit is the power and the control. Getting someone to do something really dangerous and really stupid. Dangerous for them too. Defense asserted that there's no evidence of Ghost. Well, okay, I think we all agree that Ghost is not a real organization, and no one actually thinks that ISAAC APODACA founded a secret vigilante killer group. But as to Isaac playing into the fantasy of Ghost and Kiara believing it, there is ample evidence. Discussion of a kill list, discussion of using the barn as a backup location, perks in the black market, filing reports. Oh, I'll edit a report about your kill. I'll just change it and say you did it. Kiara having a platoon tattoo or insignia related to her belief in this organization, and the mention of, oh, we'll get the money in the Bitcoin or crypto wallet. He fueled over and over and over again these notions. And yeah, she had some weird belief systems that many of us may not identify with, but those were her deeply held convictions. She truly believed her intimate partner when he would tell her things. He had a power dynamic that is almost impossible to imagine how it could reach that point, except we had a forensic psychiatrist explain how it reached that point. And it was through cultivated sex work, through domestic violence, and through years of manipulation and pushing and pushing and pushing. To say that this is a joke is laughable, or that this was a joke. To say that, oh, she was drunk, so maybe she's a poor historian. Well, if we accepted that, which that doesn't really seem to be borne out, as no officers testified that they smelled anything on her, and Sergeant B. Hill felt comfortable conducting an interview with her much later in the day, that would require you to believe that then ISAAC Apodaca jokingly told a drunk homicidal person how to use a weapon and then attacked all of their psychological weak points to just try and, as a joke, press these things forward? No, this was intentional. He wanted this to happen. He knew the narrative that he had built in Kiara's brain, and he still let Grace come over. Who brings someone to their home that they know that their partner hates at the very depths of their soul when you're the one who's set that narrative in motion for years? Someone who wants that person to kill the other person. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Wellner provided us, as I said, evidence-based data and information about the techniques and about the relationship and about the history. But we don't have to show that he put a gun to Kiara McCauley's head. We don't have to show that she felt in fear for her life. Caused, helped, encouraged. Those messages bear that out. The defendant's admissions bear that out. And whether you want to view this evidence, in this case, as showing that ISAAC Apodaca is some architect, or whether you want to view him as maybe he's a puppet master pulling Kiara's strings when he touches on those psychological weak points, or maybe it's just a poor attempt to be a Marvel comic book character named Null Void that didn't really work out for him and he got caught. He is the one that set this into motion. ISAAC Apodaca bears responsibility for Grace Jennings' murder. ISAAC Apodaca helped, encouraged, and caused that murder. Kiara has taken her responsibility, and ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you return verdicts for the guilty on both counts.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a final instruction for you before you retire. Instruction number 22. I will now ask you to retire to the jury room to begin your deliberations. You will be provided a copy of these jury instructions, and exhibits introduced as evidence will be made available to you. All of the photographs.
Sorry, I didn't watch, and now she's calling again. I had to be Papa Bear for a little bit, the joys of having children. So, and I have to get back on the phone with my daughter. So I'm going to send you all away. I'm going to try and keep an eye on when there is a verdict and go live if we catch it. But sorry, my daughter needs me. I love all of you, but I love her way more than I love you, because she's my baby girl. So I'm gonna chuck you all out of here, and someone fill me in later about how the defense closing argument was, because I bet they were horrible. But daddy duty is more important than streamer duty. I love you all, but I have a daughter who needs me.
Oh my gosh, you guys! There's a class called Basic Grifting.